Well, it's a new world order when everything is based on transactions and money and deals, as you said. And in fact, to be in Saudi Arabia is not just symbolic. There's a 70 billion investment to be made for the 2030 plan from the prince. And I think, the Americans do not have a great share of that. And maybe that was one way of kind of saying, well, we come to you rather than going to Doha or other places where negotiations are taking place today, to get something in return. And I think everything now is based on deals. And if we don't get around that, I think we will not have a seat at the table until we are capable in Europe to say to Donald Trump, well, these are the investments that we're going to make, because in fact, Europe as a whole, is 450 million citizens, and it's a huge financial power if the 27 work together, well, 27 plus the UK, because we have to look at the continent, not just the Union. And we will just have to kind of get into that mode of, talking, because diplomacy, and we saw it in Munich, the diplomacy we have known so far is finished with the Americans. I mean, look at the people
finished. So let me ask you about that, because were you in the room when J.D. Vance made his speech where he...
Yes, and I was in the room where his envoy, Mr. Kellogg, said very distinctly that the Europeans had to stop whinging and just get into actions rather than words. And in any case, they didn't have a place at the table, at the negotiation table.
They didn't have a place?
No. And then, there was silence. Then a few people reacted. And I think the president of Iceland stood up and, put him in place. And then he was kind of thinking that maybe he had gone a little bit too far, seeing the reaction in the room. But I don't know whether it's ignorance or whether it's kind of a lack of knowledge of the European culture and our history. But even to dare in the country where there was a Nazi party that launched a Second World War on the continent, to actually, say to the Germans, you have to vote for the AfD because they are the people who have, the right values and will do things right for Germany. I mean, there was total shock and disarray. And the next day, there was in the German press a drawing which I found very striking. 1938, Munich, 1938, Czechoslovakia, 2025, Ukraine. That was, that speaks to us. I don't know whether it speaks to an American. Well, I think we need action, as we were invited not to keep talking, but indeed present a plan.
Do the images that we're looking at show that Europe is proactive, or that Europe should have been preparing for this before Donald Trump got elected?
Well, of course it should have been preparing, and it should have put in place what some of us are doing now, that is to actually provide the proper military equipment to Ukraine to win that war. Because we have just helped the Ukrainians who have done wonders with old equipment or whatever they were given to actually survive and, just push the Russians out, not letting the Russians into their territory the way the invasion could have gone, fully to Kiev and then the whole country will have collapsed. We didn't actually help the Ukrainians enough because we never believed that somehow they could win. So it's too little, too late. And now we have a Trump tempo, which is indeed, I do deals in 24 hours, forcing us to act, and maybe that is a good thing. And the Canadians, of course, were to be annexed, and Greenland is to be taken over. And, these kind of, we're bombarded every day with announcements that are, I think, for the Trump's supporters, for those in America that do believe that they have voted for the right person who is delivering in a speedy way, and they have no time to breathe, that he's doing something else, every single day, even in here. I mean, we're totally saturated by what Donald Trump thinks and does and so on. So I think, is instilling this fear that maybe they need in the United States. And I have heard it in some of the American friends I spoke to, that it's a binary system. You're with them or you're against them. Absolutely. You're not, there's no neutral word.
There's no nuance.
No, it's, if you're not with Trump, automatically you're out and you're against them, and therefore you will be fired. And I think all the people around him feel that if they're not 100%, well, they could be fired in the same way as the civil servants are today. I think we need to be very, very careful as to what is happening in our next elections here in France in 2 years' time, with the role of the social media, draw the lessons of what happened in Romania, what today is happening.
The Constitutional Court cancelled the election and forced
but how did a guy that was unknown 6 months prior to the election was actually chosen to go to the second round of the election? Because, it was the Russian propaganda that did it. So if on one side we have the Russians, because we know their interference today, and we have the Americans that for converging, maybe different kind of start, but converging interest to weaken the European Union, just to put in place the extreme right everywhere, we're all in trouble. Well, that's it. Indeed, and it was reminded France made a decision a long time ago to be autonomous, and it's the only country, because the UK is not. The UK is dependent on the US, as unfortunately a lot of European countries have benefited from the security guarantee that Americans have given us, to the point of having nuclear bombs and American planes being able to carry them based on some European territories, with the agreement, obviously, with the Europeans. So if tomorrow there's an agreement between the Russians and the Americans that maybe there's no aggression pact on the Americans towards
the UK
the
has
Russians,
to follow it?
What happens?
Does the UK have to follow it?
Well, they have to, and so have
So
all
does that
of
leave
those.
France as the sole nuclear power that
Yes, and so have
that
all
is
the
an
countries
outlier?
who have F-35s that can only take off with the American agreement. So I think, we have, this is really serious. We have created this dependency because we were at peace, and for years, decades, of course, successive governments have invested their money somewhere else than in defense, because we had other priorities. And now we find that we don't have enough. But at the same time, when you say that, if you add all the various European armies, the financial power of each individual countries, if you make the sum of all of that, we do constitute something which is quite substantial, except that it has to come together with some kind of agreement. And of course, it's very difficult to have 20 different countries agreeing. And thus, the meetings that we have, when you see that what President Macron did was the right thing, to call a first meeting to see what is the next step, what do we do together. And it's easier to speak at 8 around the table than 27. And the next meeting will have to go broader and kind of say, well, what do we put on the table?
And it's going to have countries outside the EU, like Iceland.
Yes, and I think we need to be very concerned. When you started by saying the Russians, were very happy, they were heard, and they were making good steps forward. Lavrov is an incredibly skilled diplomat. I've seen him many times. And I think the Russians have to put to their population that when a peace treaty is signed, they have a list of all that they wanted, which some of it is already granted before the negotiations started, on the table to put to their population and see, we went to war, but we won it. And we will have all lost, because they will be in a position to communicate on the fact that Russia got everything that they wanted out of that negotiation, if we're not careful. I think that the Turkish president is playing a very smart game there, because everything is connected. Don't forget that we have North Koreans today fighting, the war alongside the Russians. Who would have thought about it 2 or 3 years ago? And now we have a Turkish president who is very similar to all the other leaders, having this imperialistic kind of ambition for his country. Turkey at the center of the region, and, not wanting Saudi Arabia to be too powerful because Saudi is getting something out of, the negotiations taking place on its own soil. So we have all of this is connected. It may be regional, but I think Erdogan is coming closer to Europe when, the Europeans have criticized, and only rightly so, some of the measures and things that he has done. So he's bringing himself back into the kind of European, if you like, support team. The Chinese have also indicated in a very quiet way. We haven't heard them and we haven't spoken about them, but in Munich, they were extremely active. When the Americans were playing the hard power, they were playing the soft power 100%.
Wang Yi was more moderate than J.D. Vance.
Wait to see until, the Americans have actually drawn out of the international institutions to see the Chinese taking the presidencies of various committees and so on. And they have offered also their help for the Europeans to come to the table, to put pressure on the Americans to do so, and so on. So this is a game where every country is playing a part, placing itself for the future, and having, when we talked about this new world order, as there are no more rules. I mean, the Americans are the first ones now to kind of say we're not going to recognize, the ICC or, international rules or whatever. So it's going to be, who is the strongest, who is going to win. So everybody's playing their parts to be in one camp, and then maybe the world would be divided into three.